Okay, so, Frank, it's just wild, right? The market is actually pricing a pretty major US education breach at like 68 cents this week. And Instructure, their Canvas platform, it runs something like 41% of North American higher ed. They said this whole thing, this incident, was contained on May 2nd. May 2nd. But that was 6 days ago, and the price, it just hasn't come down at all.
Yeah, Mara, and it's that static price. That's what's really telling, isn't it? Shiny hunters, they set a ransom deadline for May 12th, and they're claiming, 275 million records? Students, teachers, course enrollments, everything, across like 8,800 school districts. And then Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF, she just yesterday, she straight up named this category of attack, this kind of attack, a financial stability issue. It's huge.
Exactly. I mean, two facts that when you look at them, they really shouldn't coexist. The capital position is sitting there at 68, but then the institutional language, it's only at 55. And the thing that should normally close that gap, the SEC disclosure rule, item 1.05 of Form 8K, it doesn't even apply to Instructure because KKR, they took it private back in November 2024. That's the part that just gets me, truly.
Oh, absolutely. That's really where the pricing logic it completely separates from the institutional logic, isn't it? Because the standard way we read this, is that disclosure rules, they're supposed to close these gaps. But here's the kicker. Disclosure rules close gaps for public company entities. And Instructure, well, they're not a public company anymore, are they? So the gap, it only closes when something actually forces it to close. And on May 12th, that force is shiny hunters. Not the SEC, not FERPA, not even the state attorneys general yet. No.
Wow. So you're saying the threat actor, the actual hackers, they're functioning as the disclosure mechanism? That's just a complete inversion, isn't it? And that inversion, Frank, is the part that to me is structurally most disturbing. I mean, disclosure was supposed to be the sunlight, right? The thing that compressed information asymmetry into accountable language. Item 1.05 was adopted in 2023 specifically to force public companies to disclose material cybersecurity incidents within 4 business days. 4 business days. Instructure, they're on day 6 of contained. And the rule, it just doesn't apply.
Right, exactly. And the architecture of why that's the case is, I think, really worth being precise about. I mean, the take private, it was a totally normal LBO transaction. KKR, Dragoneer, an all-cash deal. CEO Steve Daly, he stayed in place. That's standard private equity playbook. But what's not standard, or rather what comes with it, is the disclosure regime that public company shareholders rely on to surface material cyber events. That just doesn't transfer to private ownership. The SEC's reach, it just narrows to issuers.
So 275 million records are just sitting inside a structure where the public information architecture has been voluntarily exited, not violated, but literally, Frank, exited by ownership choice. And then, to make things even more pointed, in the same week, the SEC under Paul Atkins voluntarily dismissed the SolarWinds enforcement action against the company and its CISO. I mean, that was the most consequential pre-existing cyber disclosure case in the federal docket. And it's just withdrawn.
Yeah, exactly. So you have the architecture that would have applied to a public Instructure being narrowed at the agency level for the public Instructures that still exist. And then the private Instructure, it's already just, exited the architecture entirely. The disclosure surface, it's contracting from both ends. That's the structural finding the contracts are actually pricing, not the breach itself, but the architectural absence around it. It's wild.
And that's really where CyberAd at 68, it gets super interesting as a market signal rather than just a betting market. A market that prices a 68% probability against a 55% narrative implied probability. It's doing forensic work that a 10K disclosure would normally do. It's like a public information substitute, The signal, sure, it's rough. It's a single number, no detail on what the disclosure would have contained. But the direction, it's clear and dated. June 1st resolution, May 12th load-bearing event. What I find interesting too is that Goog EU at 42 is sitting on a parallel structure.
Oh, tell me about that. What's happening there?
Well, the European Commission, they gave Google an extended deadline to respond to DMA non-compliance proposals, July 27th adoption deadline. That contract is pricing the question of whether the EU's regulatory architecture will actually execute against a platform. And the price there is roughly at narrative consensus, whereas CyberEd is pricing like way above the narrative, you know?
Which tells you the markets are reading two really different architectures. I mean, the EU has functional regulatory machinery. Article 6.7, Article 6.11, 10 to 20% of global turnover fines. Ribera and Verkunen are operating that machinery on a binding July 27 deadline. The price reflects the credibility of the architecture. CyberEd, it's pricing the absence of architecture. That's really why the gap is where it is, huh?
Exactly. And there's a third contract in the cluster that I think is, it's being underread. CPI June at 58, the June CPI question. On the surface, that's like a pure macro contract. Hormuz vegetable oil, FAO food index at 130.7, third consecutive monthly rise, totally unrelated to Canvas. But structurally, it's the same trade, just on the supply chain plane instead of the disclosure plane. It's material reality breaking through the abstraction layer. The food price index is doing for cost of living what CyberEd is doing for disclosure. Both are pricing what the official architecture isn't yet absorbing.
That's a brilliant connection, Frank. But here's the question the analysis is producing but hasn't yet answered. If these contracts, like CyberEd, if they're doing the surveillance the disclosure regime no longer does, who actually reads them? I mean, the SEC isn't reading Kalshi prices into its enforcement priorities, right? The Department of Education isn't reading them. State attorneys general, they're not building cases of contract pricing. So this forensic instrument exists. The price is public. And there's no institutional pathway from price discovery to consequence. So what is actually being priced? Is it information about reality? Or is it information about which institutional actors can no longer respond to reality? Those are not the same finding at all,
Oh, that's absolutely the right question, Amara. And I think the honest answer is that it's pricing both. It's pricing the substantive probability of the event itself, and it's pricing the absence of the institutional response that would normally follow. The two are they're so entangled. If a 10K had come out on day 4, for instance, the price would have just collapsed by day 5, either because the disclosure confirmed containment and the contract resolved, or because the disclosure forced a repricing, right? The fact that the price is still at 68 on day 6 is itself the disclosure substitute, which means the contract doesn't just predict the event, it also predicts the absence of follow-on consequence. That's what makes this a different kind of trade than a typical event contract. The price has truly absorbed the architectural void as part of its information content. It's really, really fascinating, I think.
Which means what students at Penn, at Columbia, at Wake County are actually living through this week. It's not just a finals week IT problem, is it? It's a structural test of whether disclosure asymmetry has a price discovery mechanism at all. 306,000 Penn affiliates, names, emails, Penn ID numbers, course enrollments. Shiny hunters apparently exfiltrated that data after Penn refused a $1 million ransom previously. Same threat actor, second leverage position against the same parent company in the same month. The pattern, Frank, is the company, and the disclosure regime that would have surfaced the pattern at the company level is structurally absent. It's unnerving.
Yeah, and the IMF framing on May 7th, that's the part that really elevates this from like a single edtech case to a system-level reading, Georgieva, she named AI-driven cyber attacks a financial stability issue. She specifically cited the Anthropic model as one that can find and exploit vulnerabilities across major operating systems and browsers. And Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England even said frontier AI could crack the cyber risk world open. That's not regulator language. That's central bank language, Amara. When central banks start describing a category as a financial stability risk, the architecture they're invoking is macroprudential, not enforcement. The disclosure question, item 1.05, FERPA, AG notification, it operates at one level. The financial stability question operates at a different, a much bigger level. Both are running, but neither is closing the gap, you know?
And that's the recursion, isn't it? The breach data that Shiny Hunters claims, it just becomes the input for credential stuffing at the next iteration's institutions. Same vendor, same cloud, same procurement structure. North Carolina adopted Canvas statewide in 2015. Wake County runs on it. Procurement cycles are like 5 to 7 years. The May 12th deadline does not align with a procurement review window for any major Canvas client. The institutional response time is structurally slower than the breach iteration time. So what gets priced at 68 is not the binary of one event. It's the trajectory of a system whose response time it's completely decoupled from its failure rate. And that's a problem.
Yeah, it is. And here's where this becomes, I think, even more expensive if it persists past May 12th. If the deadline lapses without confirmed PII exposure and the contract collapses toward 50, the surface story will be that the architecture held, the takeaway in the trade press. It'll be containment validated. But the structural finding is actually the opposite. What collapsed in that scenario is not the event probability, it's the test. The disclosure hole gets one more validation that ownership structure is a viable mechanism for exiting public information architecture. And within 12 months, Amara, every private equity-owned platform with critical institutional dependency, they'll have priced this in. The next breach at the next vendor will sit higher in the contract because the disclosure architecture proved voidable. The repricing won't be dramatic, it will be persistent.
And the institutional response time just stays decoupled from the failure rate, because nothing in this cycle made that response time faster. What about the converse, though?
On the converse, if the deadline executes and PII exposure is confirmed, the contract gaps to 90. State AG actions activate. FERPA pulls in federal investigation through institutional clients. That's the slower, more painful path, but it's also the path where the architecture gets repaired through state-level mechanisms and procurement scrutiny rather than federal disclosure rules. Different recovery, different timeline, different precedent. The expensive outcome isn't the leak. The expensive outcome is the precedent that ownership structure is the new disclosure boundary.
And the part that lands hardest for me, Frank, is that whichever way May 12th resolves, the disclosure architecture has already been modified, right? The question that just remains open is whether that modification is now the operating norm, or whether the next breach, the next big incident, forces a different architecture to step into the gap. Either way, the listener watching the price tomorrow morning, they're operating with information the official channels are not yet disclosing. That asymmetry is, it's the actual product right now. The fork, it resolves at 11:59 p.m. on May 12th. But watch for two specific signals before then. First, whether any major Canvas client institution issues a confirmed PII exposure notice between now and May 14th. Penn already named 306,000 affected affiliates. If one more institution names exposure with a number attached, the contract will move before resolution.
Yeah, and the second thing to watch for is whether KKR's North America Fund 13 makes any public statement about the Instructure exposure. They've held the ransom or disclose authority in reserve since the breach surfaced. The moment that authority becomes visible, the disclosure hole, that becomes the story, instead of the breach being the story itself. It totally shifts the narrative, you know?
Whichever signal arrives first, you already have the framework to read it. The price you'll see tomorrow morning is the same price you saw today. The thing that changed between yesterday and now is not what's being priced, it's the architecture being priced around the price. May 12th is when that architecture either holds or fails. And both outcomes, they confirm something the disclosure machinery used to surface and no longer does. We're not waiting to find out what happened, we're waiting to find out what's now allowed to happen without being said. It's a new era, isn't it?
And with that, my dear listeners, we truly do find ourselves at the precipice of a new era.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden currents of our digital world. If our conversation today resonated with you, please show us some love. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to help our network grow and continue these vital discussions.
Indeed, Amara. The implications of these architectural shifts extend far beyond a single data breach. They speak to the very fabric of how information and accountability are, or aren't, being managed in an increasingly private yet interconnected global system.
A system where the market whispers truths that institutions often struggle to voice. It leaves one wondering, doesn't it? What other unsaid realities are quietly being priced into our future?
Precisely. The market isn't just a forecast, it's a mirror. And right now, it's reflecting an uncomfortable silence where vital information used to reside. A silence that, as we've seen, carries its own significant